I'm not a big fan of hour-long speeches. And usually when I get a speaker, if I got a speaker, let's say my political club or a civic club, I usually say to them 10 to 15 minutes. And I don't know that I'm necessarily going to go on 10 to 15 minutes, so I didn't time it when I went through it. But usually I have a sense of how long something is, and I think it's going to be a bit shorter than that. But as Mitch and I scoped this out, we were talking about it being the first 100 days, but when we did the arithmetic, it's 90% of that, so it's the almost first 100 days. And I want to start basically out, and I always like to interject music in my talks, so I'm not going to click on my iPhone as I mention it. But the Doors' second LP was called Strange Days, and it featured a song, People Are Strange. And these are strange days indeed. I think that's one of the phrases, one of the part of the lyrics, as one considers the world around us. And I think we'll have more on that later. But frankly, in my practice, I strategize, I plan, and not all the time, but certainly when things matter. And sometimes, for some matters, I might need to think fast, almost to the point of brinkmanship. And but you expect things to occur, and not too often because you plan, you think things out, you anticipate. You might also do it in concert, in common cause, using a phrase from the Ferrer campaign that Freddie used since Tony's here, in common cause with others. And when I consider my assessment of the almost first 100 days of the administration of real Donald Trump, because his Twitter handle is @RealDonaldTrump, I see it in administration in crisis mode, like almost all the time. They're more in reaction than thoughtful deliberation. And some argue, and you hear that a lot by the pundits, that campaigns in government remain distinct and that excellence at one mode often fails to equate to the other. And I've been on both sides my entire career, and I never bought into that. I never bought into that. And the constituencies sometimes may differ somewhat, but not as much as one would think. And the only distinction, in my view, involves an incoming official and his or her team's knowledge and experience of the processes of government. I recall in a mayoral campaign, and I think it was just out of college at that point, how we were developing briefing papers. And this is in the spring, the primaries in September, general elections in November. We were developing briefing papers that outlined the functions of the various agencies and departments and boards. And that as I said, that occurred early on. And it aimed not to aid in the transition if the campaign proved successful, but it was really sort of the candidate and would be able to demonstrate a handle on governing to justify that candidate's worthiness. And nothing of that sort seemed to occur with Team Trump from day one. And I often talk about the notion of knowing enough to know what you know not at all. And in the case of this administration, one gets the feeling of being there. That Hersey Kosinski book that was later made into a movie starring the late Peter Sellers. But unlike the Chauncey Gardner character, most Americans and many abroad get no benign feeling, but a borderline fear, I think, perhaps worse. So I want to start with a nod to my good friend Bob Olivari, who Tony knows, I think Arthur knows, and he's also in Gotham, so some of you may have met him. Bob Olivari attends more than a few events involving our Constitution, and he loves to raise the sanctity of that document. And I think that document really remains our saving grace in this. What really sets the United States apart as a nation of laws involves how laws protect us from the corrupt, the incompetent, the unknowing, the dangerous. It imposes limits, and thus things can go bad but not worse. It becomes our saving grace. And that's important as we assess the first 100 days, or today, 90% of that run. What always bothered me about politics involved folks looking the other way if someone in the right place would help move an agenda. Thus, we start with GOP senators, House members, and activists who might not think well of the president, his ethics, his competence, etc. Because we're dealing with a situation where the GOP stalwarts really see Trump as a tool to appoint certain types of judges. We already got Judge Gorsuch, and to sign off on certain pieces of legislation and policies. We saw that with the hit on funding Planned Parenthood, which likely will lead to many more abortions as a result of a diminution of family health planning. So these guys knock something out because it fit with their philosophy, and we're going to get more abortions, not less, because of this action by abortion opponents. Always interesting. So the borrow from the Donald, very smart. Yeah, right. Because that's the type of thing he would tweet. And we did not see this also when a repeal of Obamacare failed. We do not see any plan to change the tax codes, and I refuse to call anything that was going to inject regressivity into the IRS code reform. I know they like to always call it tax reform, but it's only reform when you're making positive changes and interjecting progressivity. People in the administration may be individually competent. There seems to be some people with distinction that are appointed, but the overall team, the way it comes together, it takes the title of this old Jimmy Breslin book, Can't Anybody Here Play This Game? A good executive builds a good team, and that just did not happen here. Maybe it'll occur down the road, but nothing to date suggests that anytime soon. It's really like an accidental administration. In City and State this week, an old friend, Bruce Jory, and I knew him when he was almost like a teenager. I think Arthur knows him. I think Tony knows him. Recalled a comment in City and State newspaper or magazine of Professor Richard Neustadt, who's a presidential scholar. He wrote a great book called Presidential Power. It's really one of the great books about how a president can succeed. And Professor Neustadt wrote, "The presidency is no place for amateurs." And that's really what we're dealing. Perhaps a saving grace of sort involves that all the eyes on the doings of this administration, because it's an administration where ignorance, lies, and bad policy really rule the day. So we have a situation where the same attention, actually more so, that was given to the Trump campaign during the election in the print, in the cable, and all that media coverage, puts the foibles of Team Trump in our daily consciousness. So in essence, he got elected to some extent by playing the media, and now all that attention, because their ratings covering this guy still stays up, and their ratings are even higher than during the campaign. And as a result, that free coverage now keeps this administration to a large degree in check, even if Team Trump doesn't realize it that way, because they're still doing the same playbook of working the press and trying to feed it as best they can. So, you just watch the news, read the papers in print or online, and cable and Twitter and Facebook. There's just no end in how this administration is getting covered. And many things the Trump administration and the GOP may seek to undo, especially on the environmental side, may really play out in court or a rulemaking process that could take us to a new administration that appears, at least likely, according to the polling we have now. And there may be some people who might argue this administration may come to an end much sooner, but it's not part of my talk. But on the way in here, that was a little part of a discussion. So the budget process and the Hasit rule, remember the Hasit rule? And it's a rule that requires a majority of the majority. So it's a majority of the majority rule. So that makes it hard for a divided GOP House of Representatives to reach any consensus on difficult issues. Of course, some people think it's great that we should always mention it's the Hasit rule because of what caused him to sort of leave Congress. Not to that I want to have to mention it, but not a good thing. And further, we also learn how language matters, because apparently more Americans found fault with Obamacare. We were talking a little bit about that before we started to talk. But many of these same folks appear to be very happy to rest secure with coverage under the Affordable Care Act. Just fascinating. So one of the things to watch for is if Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tom Price, takes any actions that weakens healthcare delivery under an act that basically followed Romney Care and many nods to GOP imperatives, despite the refusal of any Republican to support the bill when it was passed under a Democratic Congress. So if Secretary Price acts, we actually may end up seeing a public clamor in support of single payer, a Medicare for all system. And as I mentioned before I spoke, my research and writing on single payer demonstrates that it offers a more cost-effective care program than the current system, and it pays for itself. So in many ways, the media and the commentary and the commentators appear to lower the bar on the expectations of this presidency, and I think that's one of the things we're seeing. So it's like we don't really expect a lot of success here, and when something sort of happens, it gets some play. But there's just so many faux pas, and just consider some. There was that call to Taiwan during the transition, and then more recently the call to President Erdogan from Turkey, who probably is on his way, and it really troubles me, on his way to a dictatorship. And then how the president repeatedly demonstrates an extraordinary lack of knowledge about foreign affairs in general, probably in many ways the least educated and least knowledgeable person to ever step into the Oval Office in that role. He had no problem antagonizing the leaders of our allies, Australia, Germany, Mexico, to have a diplomatic mess with Australia, one of our best allies, and it was there always sending troops to different conflicts that we were involved in, just over the refugees. The many threats he made with Mexico, all the craziness, including mentioning wiretapping with Angela Merkel, and then suggesting that the United States confiscate Iraqi oil. There seems to be no end. And then here's some more. Obviously, the refusal to release the tax returns. And I think that will come up in a lot on the questions and answers. And then even disputing the size of the inaugural audience. Why did he have to do that? And then we go to the ties with Russia and its influence of the election results. The last fall in my talk here, I did make clear, and a new book that's out today also supports the view I made, that the Clinton campaign still lost that election. And I didn't even raise all the false equivalencies when the president hits his predecessor on playing golf, as he did often, and now the current president has already spent more time on the links that his predecessor did in 8 years. And then there's the argument that he made that millions voted illegally in the November election. And here's some interesting things. And this just 2/3 of the way in, if you will, in the first 63 days in office. The Washington Post reported that the president he only made, and I said, I'm maybe having fun with it, but he only made 317 false and misleading claims. So it's about 5 a day. And then through March 30, there were 32 press briefings. And I love the press briefings. It's great theater. Whenever I'm near a TV set, whenever there's a Sean Spicer does it, I love to watch it. But 22 out of 32 press conferences, about 2/3 of them, were dominated by the tweets the president made. It should be all, when I think about messaging and about strategizing and doing what you're supposed to do, that's taking time away from that. You should be using the precious time to advance an agenda, and responding to tweets is not advancing agenda, especially those tweets are not about advancing a policy agenda. Maybe he thinks so, but I guess he doesn't know enough to know. So we can only hope for some professionalism with a lowered bar, perhaps, but I'm really doubtful it would occur. So what we really all need to be is vigilant, to watch and really speak out. So I'm going to end with a couple of perhaps movie titles that could be applicable to what's going on with this administration. Yeah. Well, one that was suggested was very simple: The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight. Somebody else said Swamp Fever. Somebody else shared with me The Madness of King George. Somebody else raised a James Bond movie. Anyone want to venture a guess? From Russia with Love. And They even somebody else even suggested a John Belushi movie, Animal House. I don't know if I'll go that far. Silence of the Lambs, Silence of the Lambs, and then I'll end with Land of the Lost. So it's really an upsetting, troubling thing that we face. But again, just going back to it, the fact that there is so much coverage and scrutiny that is out there because of cable and the TV. What the New York Times did by essentially taking really some of the best reporters that they could call that were started in City Hall in New York, who really know this administration and have ties where people in the administration who came out of New York are comfortable essentially speaking to them off the record all the time because we're reading about all these leaks. There's going to be so much that I think helps sort of quell or keep this administration from doing too much damage. And I'll be glad to take some questions now.
Is there any sense of what's happening behind the scenes with respect to the proposed science reductions, the funding partially of NIH and the National Science Laboratories? Is there kind of like background underneath opposition to them from either, the Democrats, of course, but from the local congressional delegations that lean more to Republicans? What's going on kind of with some of those cuts?
Well, I think what's going to happen with those cuts, again, it'll be how the budget resolution plays out. But the reality is a lot of these localized centers, whether it's an animal, it's Center for Disease Control, or let's say, for example, what was Brookhaven Lab, these are job centers in different communities. And ultimately, a congressperson, thinking back to Tip O'Neill, gets elected by what happens locally. So when we talk about cuts to science, to other to research programs, that's going to come into play in that way. And Congress members are going to hear from it.
How many people are in those communities? I'm just thinking of Oak Ridge in Tennessee.
I haven't heard specifically like places like Oak Ridge how a particular member thinks, but the reality is a member has to think about re-election. And if they're serious and care about re-election, they're going to look at the centers in their community that are federal, that depend on certain funding streams, and that's how it plays out. I think that played out to some extent in the discussions over Affordable Care Act, where a couple of upstate Congress members hung out to dry the downstate Congress members over funding that counties would bear or not in that solution, for example.
Has there ever been any precedent in history for such craziness? Someone was telling me Wilson was rounding up demonstrators on the streets during who was World War I. He was opposing those, which gave me some solace in thinking that we've been down this road before.
Well, if you think about it, there's always been some degree of that. Certainly even going back to the Civil War days, when there were riots in New York and in Baltimore and federal troops were called in and the like. So yeah, there's been always a push and shove between civil liberties and not. But we're in, I think, a slightly different era now where there's a different expectation and the social norms are a little different. And where there's a sense of a different kind of decorum as opposed to what might have been even acceptable in 1915, 1916, 1917 with respect to how people live. We're essentially more of an urban society. And I think, so the concept of gun toting and organizing in a different way and even having, people like acting in a gang-like manner, it's really not tolerated. And you might see it in prisons, you may see it in certain projects, but it's not behavior that is tolerated or accepted. And even people who have to endure that object to it and speak out against it.
I'm just curious in maybe what you do and who you talk to, because I certainly would like to have a better retort without going out of my mind, because I just find that I understand the argument, and now I'm going back to the well-educated person who unfortunately are far too many in New York, even right around my corner, who still are Trump supporters, is still right out there. And if anyone's at the table, it's okay. But I don't get it, and I don't know how to retort, because the issue is they're not equivalent. Saying Clinton, you could say, is a horrible candidate, or campaign didn't do the right thing. You could say she did all these things, even though they did, she was a horrible candidate. But she's not any type of equivalent to this nonsense. It's crazy.
I don't even call her a horrible candidate, Michael. But when you talk about, people having opinions about the president or even the predecessor, I think of a number of different people. There's this woman, Marsha, who end up, it could be on tape, and she may figure out that I'm talking about her, but it's okay. And I'm still friends with her on Facebook, a little bit older than I. And we worked in a number of campaigns together. She did a couple of the re-election campaigns of a councilman that I work for that Arthur knows. She had done a lot of campaigns or parts of some of the campaign works for former Congressman Gary Ackerman, who I've done some of his campaigns, including his last few. And she had been friends with a number of different Democratic elected officials over the years. She did Carol Gress's campaign for borough president. I'm just trying to put in perspective. At some point, she turned, if you will, and has been very negative towards President Obama. She'll put out some stuff that's really nasty. I remember Gary's wife posting an admonition to her for one of the things she posted. And so, and it doesn't, you sometimes just, whether somebody got upset. My mom hasn't changed in her views about things. So I don't know if somebody had a life event that caused it or something like that, but sometimes people do evolve. And it's an interesting thing. On the other hand, I post to Twitter. I'll post certain articles, retweet something. My retweets automatically go to my Facebook. I have to manually do it to LinkedIn. It's just how those systems work. And somebody I've known since kindergarten, who had been a former community affairs officer at one of the precincts, not where I live, but the adjoining community, and I think really well of the person. He was a community affairs officer, so when I was working in a councilman's office, we worked closely on a lot of things. He was helpful, and I like him a lot, to be quite frankly. But he was upset with some post I made, and on Facebook his comment was, well, you wouldn't have said that about Obama or other Democrats. And I just posted, you should look at my record, because you should know that I call things straight. And if somebody deserved to be attacked, now of course I might not have been active as Facebook during some of that time, or even on Twitter, so that maybe but a lot of things I've said and stated and have written do appear somewhere that somebody can pull off the internet. I remember when I wrote a column, just to put it in perspective, I drew on a memo that I did in government to write this piece that had to do with government ethics. And my editor, in doing their research, found a questionnaire that Freddie Ferrer answered for when he ran for mayor in 2001. Well, obviously, I drafted those answers. And they were saying I plagiarized from that. And I had to explain to my editor, yeah, here's my original memo, and that's what it went into the answers to those questions. So they had me refer to that questionnaire for whatever reason, and we worked it out. But the point is, much of my work is out there in some way or fashion. So it's an interesting thing when you say in that regard. But when you started to speak, it reminded me of an article that was in the Times, probably Monday or Sunday. I don't know which one, because I read it online, and it happened to be still on my iPad, because there's a link to something in that article that I want to actually explore. But it talked about Steve Ballmer, who was one of the chief operating officers of Microsoft, so he has a ton of money. And besides owning a sports team, his wife wanted him to do some good work with his money. So he put a project together to detail all government spending at all levels. And this is what I found that was interesting. If I can just read from this. This is him quoting. How many people work for government in the United States? This is at all levels, he asked, with the excitement of a child showing off a new toy before displaying the answer. His answer was almost 24 million people work for all levels of government in the United States.
And does that include people, the outsourcing?
Well, let me just finish this. Susan. Then people say, those damn bureaucrats, Mr. Balmer explained, channeling the criticism that government is bloated and filled with waste, fraud, and abuse. Here's the back of the quote. Well, look at that. People who work in schools, higher ed, public institutions of education, they are government employees, and they represent almost half of that 24 million. Teachers, professors, other school employees, other employees in different public colleges represent half of all the people in government jobs. Now, we haven't talked about public hospitals, the VA. When you start thinking about that. Of course, what about all the people in the Army and the Marines and the Navy, active duty fire? So when you talk about bloated government, and yeah, there's some bloat, and we can all, Arthur and Tony and I can talk about where it is. But when you look at it, the bulk of the people who are there, and probably aren't paid the best salaries that they ought to be paid in many cases, are essentially working in government, and they're a significant part of the economy. And people don't equate that. So when they're talking about blowing up a system, they don't even know what they're talking about. And maybe there needs to be more of a discussion about those kind of things. Because you don't know how many of these people, there's been a discussion, for example, that a lot of the people who are in red states get more government benefits, whether it's Social Security, whether it's Medicare, whether it could be VA benefits. Those are all entitlement programs. And they don't think about it. And these are the people who are the first to run and vote for somebody who says, I want to kill all the entitlements.
Yeah, I've always found that in too many cases, politicians have the experience, but they don't translate that into educating their constituents. And even if you hark back to the campaign, I was interested to hear Hillary Clinton actually explain how many times she was in the Situation Room. Not just the one time that I kept hearing about involving Osama bin Laden being captured and killed. What she should have been doing back then is taking that issue and educating the public that you have someone who's been in the Situation Room 0 times and someone who, and I'll make up a number, has been in there 20 times, and then give some depth to that. Before you even get into the Situation Room, you have had numerous staff meetings with defense, state, blah, 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 and fill in the blanks where you give some depth to what the office of the Secretary of State is, besides logging 6,000 or 100,000 miles, whatever she stated in the campaign. Traveling is one thing. Talk about some of the meetings with heads of state and some behind-the-scenes information that could be public on the dynamics of these difficult issues that oftentimes you just hear the end result of. And the bottom line is politicians should be educators. And she wasn't, and most aren't. And that to me is, in her campaign, might have been the difference in the...
If I could just say, so on Arthur's point, if I could say, Arthur is very right about that, and it's an unfortunate thing. And some of that comes, frankly, with an experience level. When Tony and I were driving in today, one of the things we talked about was the lack of sometimes what we like to call old hands involved in campaigns, that it tends to be more and more competent young people, and they can be very competent. But one of the things you need, thinking to what Rick does, what Mitch does, for example, is having the mentoring or the coaching so you don't make a terrible mistake. there was this really brilliant young man, and I don't want to say his name because it'll be on tape, who I met in Mario Cuomo's campaign for mayor in 1977. And later on, about 5 years later, the person had a significant position and totally blew it. And there was absolutely no reason for it. And so, the person was just really, really brilliant. And it was unfortunate. And it was something, for me, it was a learning experience because the person was just a little bit older than I was at that point when this happened. And so I was probably just out of law school, probably when that happened. About a year or two out of law school, probably when that person had his fall from grace, unfortunately. And when we were having the discussion earlier on the drive-in about the Clinton campaign, there was this book out that, as I said earlier, kind of verified the points I made about that Clinton still could have won despite everything. And one of the things the book talked about, that the campaign manager, Robbie Mook, was constantly fighting with John Podesta, who is an old warrior. You don't have to agree with everything about him, but the man was around the block, probably made more mistakes than Mook ever had made at that point, and could have helped Mook not make mistakes. One of the things I had starting out in politics was a lot of folks around my grandparents' age who had been very involved. Some of them were in Lower East Side politics before they moved out to Northeast Queens, where I live. And I was hearing all these old war stories, so I learned things that I didn't have to make that mistake because they made it, and you didn't have that. So, I mean, that's where, and the education point, I think, is to some extent, that's because they're not challenged to do the work. And, we have gerrymandered districts. Sometimes it's only a primary race, if at all. Sometimes with term limits now, people who might challenge the mayor if there were no term limits, because they might have to worry about them getting challenged at their own seat. So if I'm going to face maybe I should then face off with the mayor. They're choosing not to run. When she finished as Secretary of State, she was amazingly popular. So whether it was the act of a woman maybe running for president and people having a discomfort with that, and that being played on.
I think that's really what it was.
I don't know, Susan. I don't know if that was.
Absolutely, that's what it
Ultimately,
was.
as something, if you're a candidate and you have resources, and you've been around the block some, you have to take responsibility. And ultimately, she as a candidate has to take responsibility for how her campaign was run, who were put in certain positions, and it's sometimes a compromise because sometimes you were told, you want our support, you have to put this person on your campaign and that person on your campaign, but it doesn't necessarily have to totally drag your campaign down. And her campaign was dragged down a little bit in certain places, and they made terrible mistakes. If you look back to the debates, every time at all the debates, it was basically an economic message. And even after she locked down the nomination before the convention and just post-convention, all the basic messaging those times were economic, and she went up. When she started attacking her opponent, and it became one of those things, it went down because the message changed. Her message had to be sticking with the economics. I've always counseled candidates, never be negative. Let other people do the negativity for you. And she got involved in that and got caught up in that, and I think that helped.
I was in an Atlanta suburb after the first debate, and I was actually worried because I thought this is a stage that she just might not be able to handle, but a bully, essentially, at the other. And I thought, wow, she really did a great job. I was golfing in a foursome, and two of the people were just suburban people from outside Atlanta, and I'm just figuring that everyone saw what I saw. I mean, it was decisive to me. No. These two guys were like, Trump won the debate, and so I think a lot of people were dug in very early, and so the difference between the poor campaign and or what you're talking about, I think, is the difference between winning by a little, or losing in this case by a little, to winning in a landslide, which she should have. it's not a question of, I mean, you can have a pretty poor campaign and still get, what is it, 80,000 votes. I mean, a lot of people who voted for the Green Party, and a lot of people who sat home because they didn't get those are the people who lost the election. She should have won in a landslide, got a lot of Republicans to vote for and all that. That didn't happen. But she could have won by just getting the people who either went to the Green Party or stayed home.
Yeah, but I want to get back to that just before Tony goes in. When you talk, it's important to remember on that issue how some people who might have been found the current president personally abhorrent because of things he said or physical things he was alleged to do and so on, or that he admitted to doing because he said he did it, that they put that aside, just as certain members of Congress and senators are putting that aside because they saw the opportunity to make certain appointments to the Supreme Court, saw certain types of legislative and policy initiatives that they wanted. So they're essentially holding their nose at that. And that was important to them, more important to them than giving the ability, let's say, of maybe Hillary would have gone a little bit further to the left and picked somebody like Loretta Lynch, for example.
It's one of the worst campaigns I've seen managed. And I've done a lot of campaigns. And I was on Chuck Schumer's first race for Senate. And there's a lot of red flags early on. This is inside baseball that I do. Folks in Michigan were telling them early on, yo, we got a problem here. Folks in Wisconsin, for months, we're telling them we have a problem on the ground. They were not putting enough money on the ground early on. They just expected for Obama's vote to translate into her. She didn't put the work in. Now, I've met Hillary, I've been in a room with Hillary. Hillary is great. In this room like this, she is just been killed, knocked your socks off. But in a large audience, it's just not her. She's not her husband.
It's not who she is.
It's just not who she is. But the campaign blew it. I mean, you just can't sugarcoat it. Not only in Wisconsin, not only in Michigan, but also early on in Pennsylvania, they were saying, "Hey guys, you got a problem," and they were saying that you're not funding this campaign to the degree that you need to fund it. So it is partly.
And what were they doing in Arizona and Georgia, and wherever else they were? Utah.
They actually believe that they had an opportunity to do some things in Arizona, and about that Obama was able to do. She's not Obama.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is, if the Clinton campaign had the wherewithal, and it did, to overcome that, certainly the Democratic Party has the wherewithal to overcome that. And obviously the first step is not to wait till 2020, or if some magical thing happens with the I word. But
what's that going to do? Is it going to get Pence in this?
Well, we can talk. I'm not so sure that it plays out exactly as simple as that, because I think there's just if in fact that road, if we were to go down that road, I suspect it will take down a lot more than just. By the time that plays out, there may be a Democratic speaker. That's number one. So you might be talking about President Pelosi in your scenario.
It changes the focus of where we are right now. The two other goes back to, you said the sanctity of the Constitution, and Michael, I think you talked about you're scared. That's not your word, but I am too. I'm really worried, and I wonder what is the worst that could happen here. I said to a Swedish friend of mine, my fear is the loss of our democracy, the loss of our civil rights. And his fear is that he will start a war, and as war, he can hang on to presidency past, the time of election. And you did suggest that we can trust our systems, but I see erosion here daily, and the frog in the water that's heated slowly.
Well, I think if anything, there's a real respect, even in the armed forces, for that matter, for the rule of law. And that's how these people are sensibilized, socialized, and taught. So it's not going to be the equivalency of what people would think happened after 1933, when that person whose name I don't even want to mention was able to essentially turn a chancellorship position into much more. That I just don't think is possible in our system. And remember, we're a federal system also where there's states and the like, so it's not so simple about that for something like that to occur to begin with. And if you harken back to Watergate, the bottom line is a president who had that kind of power, and it certainly was an awful, awful, awful lot smarter than this person. There's no question. There's no question the difference. You know, it's very possible that that person was borderline brilliant as much as he was, you know, he had a degree of stupidity. And Arthur and I can talk a lot about brilliant elected officials who've done stupid, stupid things. But that's not the point here. So I think if we have already, what happened during Watergate shows that, in essence, there is pushback. And now there is just so many more tools. The media tools are there and sharpened focus, that I talked about that earlier in my talk. So I think the fact that we do have a constitution, that we have a firm sense of law and a commitment in that regard, and people don't want to talk about giving away. They don't want to talk about, I don't think the most right-wing kind of Republican wants to talk about having a dictatorship, or even suggesting that a dictatorship, if you will, which is the fear that maybe is sort of discussed, they wouldn't want to accept that or rationalize that in return for any sort of policies that they want. They're not going to go that far.
Were you talking about 1933? You're talking about your friend from Sweden worrying about war, like a war being something that could help him gain popularity, and if you start attacking North Korea or whatever it is. Well,
let's look at that. If I can end on that. It's said by some of the pollsters, and unfortunately Dr. Goldhaber isn't here to confirm that, but it's been said by pollsters, aggressive warlike acts by a president can usually increase their numbers like 6-7%. And if that occurred after the mother of all bombs got dropped in Afghanistan, or after those cruise missiles in Syria, if in fact any of that jumping occurred for this particular president, and he's still at 41%, he's in deep trouble. And
but that's not war.
No, but that's a story.
Would be if we took on North Korea and began to literally bomb them into submission like we did in Iraq.
Okay, but let's talk about that. Do you
I'm
understand?
not suggesting we do it.
Does everybody understand where the city of Seoul is? That it's within. The city of Seoul is within 20 miles of the DMV. And there's a lot of suburban sprawl, so that much of, you might say, the ex-urban areas of Seoul, Korea are almost right at the DMZ. So there's no general, no admiral who's going to really want to see that with that they accepted a presidential order that caused a massive artillery barrage of Seoul. So I cannot see something like that occur at all. Mitch?
When we talk about the 100 days, so we talk about sports, and people say in a 5-game series, 85% of the time whoever wins the first game, they're going to win the series. And there's all these different facts, right? So what is the real importance of the first 100 days, if you had to say historically, or is it like a media thing? Like for us, we say, well, you know, here's the first hurdle, so let's just pay attention to it and make it a thing. Or is there a historical significance to what happens in those first 100 days really portrays what happens for the 4 years?
Well, usually you get an agenda put out there. Think of Lyndon Johnson when he came in 64, and we had a lot of amazing initiatives passed. That's not happening here.
Right.
If anything, you saw a lot of infighting, a lot of wasted time, a lot of fluff. You had some meetings. We've had a lot of discussion about how many appointments haven't been made all across the administration.
Obamacare.
I mean, it's been, you've basically been watching, we've been watching the reality president, maybe? That's what we've been seeing. So if I can take it to a close, because we do have some time of the essence, and I want to thank everybody, A, for coming and having this very incentive, for having this very thoughtful exchange on this. But the bottom line is, again, that we be vigilant, that we know that there's the media out there is going to be vigilant. We know that, if you will, the many on the other side of the issue, or you might say the Democrats, are going to be vigilant. There will be people, I guess, on the GOP side who will be vigilant, and all that vigilance will translate, I think, over time into some positive outcomes, even if there is some pain that we endure in the short term. And again, thank you all.